tell me, when did your dad know in life that he wanted to get into radio?
You know, it's funny, I had to research that a little bit because the starting thought, given you kind of tipped me off on that question, was a file not found in my head. So fortunately, my dad was a record keeper and also a writer all of his life, it seemed. And we found a autobiography that we date back to his junior high, middle school kind of timing, maybe 13 years old. And he wrote in there that he uh, wanted to pursue, I'm even going to read it, I hope someday to be a journalist, a radio announcer, or a moving pictures tap dancer. Because it was he was born on that kind of threshold of, silent films into films with audio was the threshold of his growing up. And he was a dancer. He actually was a professional tap dancer and had a dancing school at one time in Fond du Lac. But so he was really into dancing, but journalism and radio announcer are both listed. So that goes back to like 1935.
Wow.
Wow. Yeah. And if that was his dream, it came true eventually. He started at KFIZ in 1953 part-time. He would have been a young family man then. It would have been probably a passion. He wanted to be in radio, but it was also a second job because he had, 4 kids and 3 more would follow. My parents eventually raised 7 of us, and making ends meet, just getting it done. So 53 was part-time, and he went full-time at KFIZ as an announcer and as traffic manager doing the log, which you'll know. But back then it was paper log. It was hand typed, carbon paper. He'd hammer out, this commercial plugs in here, this program starts here. You know what a log is, but yeah. And so 53 part-time, 1960 full-time.
And what was he doing prior to working in radio? I know you said he had another line of work, other job or jobs.
Probably the most prominent one would have been as a machinist at Giddings and Lewis by day. And, he had other roles. He at one time he worked for a Western Union office. He worked, just different things as a young man, kind of finding his way. But I would say that Giddings and Lewis was kind of those were the 2 he balanced at one time as a young family guy, as a young dad. Giddings and Lewis and KFIZ.
So 60, he goes full time, and what do you know about what was he doing? I know you mentioned announcing. Was he in news or just a general announcer? What
he
was he doing on the air?
Yeah, he wasn't news yet, but he was like pulling a shift. He was a DJ basically. It was KFIZ was the only radio station in Fond du Lac County at the time, or in Fond du Lac at least. As a young kid, I loved visiting the station because I have the radio blood in me also, but I loved going in there as a young kid. And they would answer the phone one of 2 ways. It'd either be KFIZ or radio station, because they were it. That was it. It wasn't like which radio station, it was radio station because they were the radio station. That's how prominent and early they got their start.
How did he get into news eventually? How did that all come about?
Well, I don't have the exact answer to that, other than in 65, he was named or accepted the role of news director. And for the life of me, I don't know if anybody else you've talked to has surfaced a name, but it's escaping me at who would have been news director. At the time, they were owned by the Reporter, by the Lang family. And so the news operation on the first floor of 18 West 1st Street, which is where the station and Fond du Lac Reporter were based, Commonwealth Reporter, a lot of that news gathering, frankly, happened downstairs. They had a staff of reporters and writers and what have you. But Dad, did his own thing from 65 forward. He had a beat where he, literally stop at the safety building and talk to, the dispatcher or the sheriff or the police chief at the time, and, look at the overnight reports and create news out of if there was newsworthy things happening. attending city council meetings and all the likely things. A politician comes to town, or anything that was newsworthy. So, and then of course, we have lost sight of it today, but the Associated Press teletype was constantly hammering in the background of any radio station or any news operation, just churning out row after row of text on boxed paper that you'd rip and read. Here's a slew of paper, and you sort through it, and there's weather forecasts and there's news to to share and things like that. So between gathering his own news and then being fed news on a regional and national level from Associated Press, that was kind of the role he had. Also, weather coverage, emergency weather coverage when things got nasty. He'd leave home, leave family and kids and mom. He had to go on the air, right? Because he's in radio, and that was his role.
How long was he at the station? When did he eventually sign off?
Well, he some of the people that I'm sure you're focusing on and showcasing in this tribute to 100 years of KFIZ, people like Ron Harvey, Joe Gazer, and what have you, were not only colleagues but close friends. I mean, this was a camaraderie of people back then, and not unlike today. It can be a chummy business because you're working tightly as a team, and you're kind of blending one show into the other, and there has to be a lot of communication. But he went from 1960 full-time. He stayed with KFIZ up to 73, which is right around that time when the Langs sold the station to Don Jones. And I was a young teen at the time. I was actually the first janitor at the new broadcast center at Cotton in Maine. I would ride my bike to empty waste baskets and dust and do things like that. And he transferred over to the new station, the broadcast center, in 73. But later in 73, his friend Ron Harvey, who was both a down the street neighbor of ours, but also a family friend and also a radio colleague, was now the general manager at WFON, which was not associated with KFIZ at the time. They were the new station in town, signing on in 67. And Ron forever wanted my dad to come work for him, but of course, that wasn't an easy pull. So, but finally put something together that got my dad to say yes, and my dad crossed the street, as you say, and went to WFON in the fall, I believe, of 73, not long after they moved into the new building. And he was assistant manager there. He didn't need to be news director because they had one of those already, but he did a lot of different things. But Ron finally got his way and got my dad to head over to the other station. So 73 would have been it. In 75, he exited radio. So
At FON for a couple of years. Got it.
Correct. Yep.
What do you think some of his favorite memories were being on the air and working at the station?
He was always an organized guy. He was always he'd label things and he'd file things, and he was just good at keeping things in order. So I don't think he loved typing the logs. I think that was something he had the capacity for, but it wasn't love. He loved being on the air. He loved hosting Party Line, which was the community affairs talk show. We'd have guests in the studio, the city manager, a psychiatrist, someone running for office, the Humane Society people, just anything going on. It was the social media of its day. Those talk shows, Party Line and Woman's World, had a kind of a female emphasis. Wilma Needry hosted that. Being on the air, delivering the news, covering the news, delivering what people needed to know if they were paying attention to the news. Those were very much things he was very fond of. And then he also got a gig as Santa Claus on Danny the Elf. He was the voice of Santa for years and years and years. Ron discovered that my dad had a great talent for Santa Claus. And so that very much was an overlay of his radio, but that was kind of a special little treat for him to do that show.
What memories do you have of growing up, listening to the station, listening to your dad?
It's we laughed about it being the only radio station. Cars in that early day, those 50s and 60s, only had AM radios. You know, when I went to work at WFON shortly after he went to work there in 73-ish, I'm in high school. We were still pitching FM converters to convert AM radios in cars to be able to receive an FM signal. So I mean, that's how far back we go. But my memories of radio would be, gosh, I was so intrigued with it that me and Bill Bolthe, who's Ron Harvey's son, and my little brother Kerry would play radio station, you know, as kids in Bill's bedroom. We had a cassette recorder, we had a mic, we wrote ads, we pretended we were our dads in radio. And we listened to a lot of radio. You know, you woke up in the morning and the radio was on in the kitchen. You didn't have the TV in the kitchen yet. You had a radio. You were listening to Joe Gazer. You know, you were getting the weather. You were hearing what you had to wear that day. You were getting the school lunch menu, and you drive into school. It's in the car. The radio's on. You know, the radio was very much the big media. You know, especially you know, back in that day, we had TV, but you know, your morning routine was very much geared around the radio, it seemed. And then just watching him work, you know, flanking him, hanging out at the station was a joy for me. So just watching the mechanics and things that happen in a radio station. And they even had an engineer for those early days. You know, the announcer sat in one room and get across the glass from the engineer who's doing stuff on the board. But all the DJ or all the announcer had was kind of a kill switch, an on-off mic switch, and a desk. And, you know, a lot of, you know, cut, you know, stretch, you know, the hand signals. It was that day. I remember that.
Final thoughts, KFIZ 100 years. Wow, what a legacy.
Mind blowing. You know, I'm having been born in 57, I straddled both my dad's career in radio and many other associates of his, the colleagues of his, names we've talked about. So I got to witness all that as a young person. Then I got to be in it, but I also got some involvement with, you know, KFIZ was so, you know, early in the game, being 1922, that like Seal Fairbanks, you know, who I got to know working with Ron Harvey on some projects and things like that, literally played organ live in the studio at KFIZ, and her husband Shorty was one of the early pioneers in radio at KFIZ. I got to know Seal. So like there's this legacy of history that goes so deep. It was fun kind of being a little fit onto that, knowing at least about it and hearing the stories that Ron and Seal would tell of those old days, seeing my dad get involved in it. Then me kind of rolling up into it, both as a janitor and eventually on the air. And it's just been, it's been wonderful to have that in my life. And it's still, you know, still going. I still have family members that tap in and listen, and, you know, it's still Fond du Lac's KFIZ.